In this episode of League of Legends Unleashed, we delve into the extraordinary tale of Aatrox. Since the very beginning of League of Legends, many champions have sparked controversy. Some faded into obscurity while others were altered or reworked, but few remain as infamous and unforgettable as Aatrox. This isn't just any ordinary champion. This is Aatrox, the Darkened Blade, a name that still stands as a stark reminder of Riot's missteps, a symbol of ambition colliding with reality, and one of the most polarizing champions in the history of the game. For over a decade, Aatrox has been more than a character. He's a cautionary tale of what happens when untapped potential is left to simmer and the consequences of trying to reinvent something beloved. Riot may not be keen to revisit his journey or the outcry surrounding his transformation, but we are. Today, after 12 years, we're breaking down the story they'd rather keep buried. The rise, fall, and rebirth of a champion who has etched his name into the very fabric of League of Legends. At first, the name Aatrox carried immense weight, the embodiment of power, despair, and rebellion. A darkened warrior cursed and tragic, wielding a blade that drained the life of its enemies. Just the splash art alone could send shivers down anyone's spine. Aatrox was supposed to be unstoppable, but then something changed, didn't it? Remember the first time Aatrox appeared in action? A towering figure, a glowing sword, the promise of an unrelenting fighter who could sustain through anything. Riot marketed him as raw power at your fingertips, and yet, over time, the image began to crumble. Aatrox wasn't quite the fearsome warrior they promised. Instead, what we got was something unfinished, something that felt rushed. Champions being overlooked isn't new. Meta shifts and balance patches can push even the strongest champions out of relevance. But Aatrox's story? It's different. It's a masterclass in how Riot can fumble a champion's identity. The lore, the design, the concept, it was all there, but none of it was ever fully realized. Instead, Riot let Aatrox drift into irrelevance for years, leaving fans clinging to the hope that one day their beloved Darkened Blade would finally receive the attention he deserved. Before Aatrox even stepped onto the Summoner's Rift, Riot had already set expectations sky high. This wasn't just a champion release, it was a declaration of innovation. Riot introduced him as the first of the Darkened, a mysterious and terrifying race of corrupted ascended warriors. His backstory was a tragic masterpiece, a noble protector of Shurima who had wielded immense power to defend his people from the void, only to succumb to the corruption of blood magic. Aatrox was not just a conqueror or a power-hungry villain, he was a being of despair, seeking ultimate release by destroying everything, including himself. The promises didn't stop there. Riot's hype machine painted Aatrox as a juggernaut on the Rift, a fighter who could sustain through endless battles while wielding a blood-drinking blade. His splash art and design radiated power and tragedy, creating anticipation for a champion unlike anything players had seen before. But when Aatrox finally launched in patch 3.8, it became painfully clear that the reality was far removed from the promise. What players got was a clunky, unpolished champion whose gameplay failed to match the grandeur of his design. Aatrox's abilities, while flashy on paper, felt awkward and disjointed in practice. His ultimate, Massacre, scaled with ability power, a baffling choice for a champion designed to build attack damage. This mismatch was more than just a mechanical oversight. It symbolized how disconnected Riot was from the identity they themselves had established for Aatrox. For a champion meant to be a force of nature, Aatrox often felt like a gamble. His sustain, while conceptually strong, was countered too easily by crowd control and anti-healing effects. The result? Aatrox quickly became irrelevant in competitive play, his potential overshadowed by a myriad of design flaws. Riot had promised a groundbreaking champion, but what they delivered was a frustrating mess that left players wondering how something so hyped could fall so flat. Aatrox's disappointing release wasn't just a fluke, it marked the beginning of an era of neglect. Riot made bold promises about his potential, yet after his launch, their support for the champion was almost non-existent. While other champions received regular updates, reworks, and balance changes to stay relevant, Aatrox was left to rot in the shadows. To put this in perspective, Aatrox went over 1,375 days without a meaningful update. During this time, the meta evolved, new champions were introduced, and older champions were modernized, but Aatrox? Riot didn't seem to care. A small armor buff here, a bug fix there, these changes weren't enough to salvage his gameplay or address his glaring weaknesses. This neglect wasn't just frustrating, it was insulting to the small but passionate community of players who remained loyal to Aatrox. They held on, hoping that Riot would one day realize the potential they had so confidently promised. But year after year, the silence was deafening. Riot's lack of attention signaled that Aatrox had been abandoned, a champion that they were unwilling or unable to fix. After years of neglect, Riot finally broke their silence in 2017 with a mini rework for Aatrox. Patch 7.5 marked a shift in how the champion was played, introducing mechanics that finally felt cohesive. His passive was overhauled, removing its convoluted health-draining mechanics and replacing them with clear power spikes. Riot eliminated the punishing health costs on his abilities, allowing players to focus on aggression without worrying about draining themselves dry. For the first time in years, Aatrox felt fluid and rewarding to play. His revamped Bloodwell offered attack speed bonuses when fully stacked, creating defined moments where players could shine in battle. These changes made him more viable, more intuitive, and, for a brief moment, it seemed like Riot had finally begun to understand what Aatrox needed. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Less than a year after the mini rework, Riot announced a full VGU for Aatrox. This decision left the community reeling. Why rework him now? Aatrox had just started gaining traction in both casual and competitive play. Players were learning to master the new mechanics, and for the first time, the Darkened Blade felt like a champion Riot had promised in 2013. But instead of building on this newfound momentum, Riot decided to tear it all down. The announcement of the VGU wasn't just a surprise, it felt like a betrayal. Players had waited for years for Riot to care about Aatrox, and now that they finally did, it was only to replace him with something entirely different. The mini rework, which had shown so much promise, became nothing more than a footnote in the champion's turbulent history. The community's frustration was palpable. Riot's decision to rework Aatrox so soon after fixing him raised questions about their priorities. Was this about improving the game, or about pursuing their own creative vision at the expense of players who had supported Aatrox through his darkest days? For many, it felt like Riot had given them a glimpse of what Aatrox could be, only to snatch it away and replace it with a champion they no longer recognized. When Riot's full VGU for Aatrox was released in 2018, it marked a turning point in the champion's history, one that would forever divide the community. On the surface, the rework was a technical success. Riot introduced a mechanically intensive kit that rewarded precision, timing, and skill. The new Aatrox had powerful abilities like the Darkened Blade, Q, a skill shot heavy attack that demanded precise hits, and World Ender, R, an ultimate that temporarily turned him into an unstoppable juggernaut. Professional players embraced the reworked Aatrox, and he became a dominant force in the competitive scene almost overnight. His oppressive laning phase, teamfight utility, and high mechanical ceiling made him a staple pick in tournaments. Riot, it seemed, had achieved their goal of modernizing Aatrox into a champion that could thrive in both casual and professional play. But beneath the surface, something was missing. For many players, the new Aatrox wasn't a rework, it was an entirely different champion. Gone were the drain tank mechanics that had defined him. His identity as a warrior who sustained through battles had been replaced with a high-skill combo playstyle that felt more like Riven than the Darkened Blade players had grown to love. The most polarizing change was the removal of his iconic revive mechanic. The original Aatrox had a passive that granted him a second chance in fights, symbolizing his struggle for survival. The reworked Aatrox initially kept the revive tied to his ultimate, but after repeated balance issues in competitive play, Riot removed it entirely. This decision felt like the final nail in the coffin for fans of the old Aatrox. What remained was a champion that bore his name and aesthetic, but none of his soul. This wasn't just a rework, it was a deletion. Riot had promised to modernize Aatrox, but instead, they erased what made him unique. The frustration among players was compounded by Riot's own roadmap language, which made no mention of preserving Aatrox's identity. Unlike other reworks such as Warwick or Kayle, where Riot emphasized maintaining the champion's core themes, Aatrox's update felt like a complete replacement. For many, the VGU was a betrayal. Riot had spent years ignoring Aatrox, only to finally rework him into a champion that alienated his most loyal fans. The rework's success in competitive play did little to console those who loved the original Aatrox. Instead, it served as a reminder that Riot's vision often prioritizes their own creative ambitions over the wishes of their player base. Today, Aatrox stands as a paradox, a champion who has both thrived and suffered, succeeded and failed. On one hand, his rework brought him into the spotlight, making him a force to be reckoned with in competitive play. On the other hand, it erased the very identity that had drawn his most loyal players to him in the first place. Riot turned him into a meta-defining powerhouse, but in doing so, they abandoned the core of who Aatrox was meant to be. The patches that followed his rework only deepened the divide. Riot struggled to balance a high-skilled champion for both professional and casual play, leading to repeated adjustments that watered down his original vision. The removal of his revive mechanic, the endless tweaks to his sustain, and the constant shifts in his playstyle turned Aatrox into a shell of the champion he once was. While he remains viable in the current meta, the sense of uniqueness and identity that once defined him is gone. Aatrox's story is more than just a tale of a champion. It's a reflection of Riot's evolving philosophy. His rise, fall, and rework encapsulate the tension between creative ambition and player loyalty. Riot promised players a champion who was tragic, powerful, and unique, but what they delivered was a reminder of how easily those promises can be broken. For some, Aatrox's rework is a success story, proof that Riot can modernize outdated champions and elevate them to new heights, but for others, it's a tragedy. Aatrox isn't just the Darkened Blade. He's a symbol of what happens when a developer loses sight of the players who brought their game to life. The community's calls for a revert may never be answered. Riot seems committed to their new vision for Aatrox, and his original identity might be lost forever. But one thing is certain, Aatrox's journey will continue to provoke discussion, spark debate, and remind players of the complexity of game development. Aatrox is more than a champion. He's a testament to the highs and lows of League of Legends, a character who reflects both the potential and the pitfalls of Riot's ambition. This has been Christopher Romance signing off. Make sure that you like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.